didn't take long for the national media to see what was happening in Missouri. The fatal police shooting of an unarmed black teenager had turned the town of Ferguson into a tinderbox and a symbol of African-American anger at overzealous law enforcement. But as reporters tried to get at the story, they also got caught in the crossfire. Exactly what led a police officer to shoot and kill 18-year-old Michael Brown remains unclear. But two facts not in dispute. Brown was unarmed and his death touched a very deep nerve. But among the protests and demonstrations were incidents of looting, leading some media outlets to focus on the mayhem.
Do you believe a lot of the looting and a lot of what has happened is a result of outside agitators?
Regardless, the ensuing police crackdown was militaristic, with jarring images usually associated with war zones. Then it was the media's turn.
Holy!
A television crew from Al Jazeera America got tear-gassed with no apparent justification.
Stop videotaping, let's grab our stuff and go.
And Washington Post reporter Wesley Lowery took this video as he and another reporter were arrested at a local McDonald's. He was later released without charges, but not without some advice from MSNBC's Joe Scarborough.
When the cops tell you, for like the 30th time, let's go, you know what that means, son? It means let's go.
But Wesley Lowery was having none of that.
There's so much happening here, and instead of getting more reporters on the ground, we have people like Joe Scarborough who are running their mouth.
That may be true, but as to those facts on the ground, we're still waiting. And this afternoon, police in Ferguson said that just before the shooting, Michael Brown was being pursued as a suspect in a robbery at a nearby convenience store. These are images from security camera video released by police that allegedly show Brown pushing a store clerk. So does the news that Brown may have been involved in a crime just before the shooting change the framing of the story. Joining me to hash it out are John Keller of WBZ and Tom Fiedler of Boston University, Callie Crossley of WGBH News, and Dan Kennedy of Northeastern University. Well, I'll answer that. It actually doesn't really change it. But if they had released that video earlier, it might have mitigated the circumstances that followed. Because actually the police chief also admitted that the police officer involved in confronting Michael Brown did not know that he had been a suspect in a store robbery just minutes earlier. Apparently he was walking down the street in the middle of the road. I think he was still carrying the cigars that he took from the store. But so then the police chief says, now we have told you everything we know. Well, no, you haven't. You haven't told us why the police officer felt he needed to shoot Michael Brown. Well, how come we're still missing that piece of information? You know, where's the data on that? Why isn't that cop telling us what happened?
That is a big unanswered question, and obviously the pressure is going to stay on until we get an answer to that question. One thing that has really struck me about the coverage of this, there have been so many things that we could talk about, but I want to focus a little bit on the role of citizen media in this, because on, I believe it was Wednesday night, the cable channels were a little bit slow to start covering this live, so we started looking around, and there was this amazing live stream coming from an activist on the streets of Ferguson. It was like 25 or 30 minutes of live footage of peaceful protesters essentially being attacked by the police with rubber bullets and everything else. It was an amazing thing to watch. Now, you don't know everything, you don't know what happened beforehand, but nevertheless, incredible footage. The other point is there were actually 3 journalists arrested, not just 2. The third was actually Ferguson Alderman Antonio French, who had been posting video to Twitter for days of the protests. And the same night that Wesley Lowery and Ryan Riley of the Huffington Post were arrested, Antonio French was also arrested, and he was held overnight. I believe the other 2 were released immediately.
Yeah, they were released. Anybody want to start?
Well, you know, there's so much. It seems to me if there is a takeaway right now, the facts of the arrest, as you say, Emily, are so shrouded in doubt that
of the shooting, you mean?
Right. That's right. The shooting are shrouded in doubt that that's going to really take, I think, a serious investigation to get to the bottom of. And that's going on. Although you generally start with the policy that for police to use deadly force, they're supposed to use the minimum force necessary necessary to make an arrest? And that appears to be a question that's substantive. A lot of questions around their slow, the release of the name of the policeman involved. I mean, that kind of thing is usually, sounds like an authoritarian regime when you get to that. But I do think what it has been stimulated by this, that's a really interesting question for us to look at everywhere else, is how militarized police operations have gotten, and not just in major cities. I mean, we're used to seeing this maybe around national conventions, and when you see that kind of militarization in a suburb, and that immediately the presence of that kind of force is going to cause polarization. I think back to my younger days reporting the 1972 presidential campaign in Miami Beach, which came on the heels of '68, which is infamous for police brutality. And the police chief in Miami Beach was a guy named Rocky Pomerantz, and he was famous for wading out into crowds, nothing more than a jacket and a tie, and he had his police operate that way. There were no serious police violence incidents in 1972 at the Democratic Convention because of that response. We saw that in the second night now in Ferguson. That, to me, is a question that I think we all need to wrestle with. Why are police departments, why do they see the need to respond with such overwhelming military force to something like that?
Well, I think that also speaks to a lack of community exchange and involvement with the police, but also with journalists. Because a lot of discussion around this is like, how do we frame this, because we don't quite know what's going on. Well, you don't know anybody in the community to talk to. So you can't even know where to begin. So I mean, that's one of the things that struck me about this, and the fact that when I think it's Captain Johnson came in, and the minute I'm from here, and he just walks with the people and says, you know, this does not absolve anybody from doing any looting, but we can have a peaceful protest. You can have a peaceful protest. That's not what we're here to do. It reminded me of when Russell Honore, the general, was sent to Katrina after that scene was entirely militarized, and people couldn't even get water. And the very first thing he did was say, get out of those tanks, get out, take those uniforms off. Now we're going to talk to the people here who desperately need our help. We're supposed to protect and serve all of us who are doing this. So I think, to me, the militarization of the police, the interaction with the community prior to Captain Johnson coming in, was the other side of journalists as well not knowing the community to begin to try to unpeel what actually happened here. And what's wrong, by the way, there's a whole question of, how to frame this. Well, did he do it? Was he guilty? Even if he was in the armed robbery, or not the armed robbery, in the robbery or not, or was he absolutely innocent? You can tell the story with both sides. It's a both and story. Here, this kid was going into the shop, obviously with a friend, and they getting into trouble, perhaps.
It was the police's fault for not telling us that.
Well,
a week later,
Is there any chance, by the way, that Captain Johnson could be our next president? Really? I mean, this guy is spectacular, and I'm keeping a close eye on him. I think I might start that Johnson for president bandwagon. I think this is an instructive lesson, this whole thing, and it's continuing to unfold into not so much what the media should do as to what the media should not try to do. And again, that term is so expansive, but I guess I mean the mainstream media and so forth. Don't try to be private eyes. Don't try to go in and solve the crime within 24 hours. The interviews with young Mr. Brown's friend, who was present on the scene, certainly made for compelling TV. If I were there on the scene and I figured out who he was, sure, I'd try to interview him too, but I'm not sure that necessarily added useful information, at least when it's put on the air unchecked and unverified. I'm looking, I think we should try not to be quite so immediate, but provide some context. I was mentioning beforehand, just today, the day we're taping, the chief of the Ferguson police came out and said, I had no idea the community was so alienated from us. When I first heard about this story, I Googled Ferguson, Missouri, African Americans, and up popped information about 2 recent reports about police brutality and racial bias in their operations out there. So I guess the police chief isn't online. But there's a rush to just own the story, get all these aspects, a million live, and in that context, background, broader understanding, unfortunately all too often get lost.
Yes.